Canada, true, north, strong, and free. Home of the maple leaf and the double-double. Patriotic and proud. Canada has a rich but comparatively brief history. While Canada legally became a country in 1867, it wasn't until the First World War that Canada had entered the global economy. Proud of their contributions at the Battle of Ypres, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and Somme, Canadians began to forge a national identity. But this national identity was one of xenophobia and wartime propaganda against those that immigrated to Canada seeking refuge. The First World War broke out on August 5th, 1914, when Britain declared war. The war had not come as a surprise to anyone.
In the years leading up to the First World War, the various powers of Europe found themselves in an alliance system which was all about maintaining the balance of power. That balance of power was thrown off by Germany's rise. What you're talking about is a loss of that equilibrium that had kept the peace in Europe for decades, and a gradual, willful descent into war.
At the time, Canada was attempting to increase their population by encouraging European immigrants and spreading the promise of a better life in Canada. Once immigrants arrived, it became clear to them that these were false promises, and when the war broke out, the situation became worse for them, especially immigrants from the Ukraine and the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
For average Canadians, the reality is that Austria-Hungary, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is an enemy nation of Canada and Britain during the First World War.
Enemy aliens, as they were called, were forced into 24 internment camps across the country. Around 8,600 people of Austro-Hungarian descent were interned, the majority being young men, and were detained from the beginning of World War I until 2 years after the end of the war on November 11, 1918. These camps were work camps where the prisoners were forced to build roads and clear land. These camps were strict and maintained remarkably poor living conditions.
The reality then was that the people living in those camps faced hardships that came along with being in a remote location. If you were in northern Ontario, as an example, or in the mountains of British Columbia, you were far away from medical services, your food had to be brought in.
These camps were heavily guarded by military personnel that had either already returned from the war or were unable to serve overseas. The camps were also fortified by fencing and barbed wire. In spite of the defenses, many prisoners attempted to escape. A few were even successful.
They are fenced camps with barbed wire, with perimeter guard posts, some cases guard towers. People were often asked to sleep in tents inside of that barbed wire fence. So they are prison camps in very much the classic sense of the word.
Many internees attempted to depend on the deplorable conditions of the camps with varying degrees of success.
So these are civilian internment camps, right? And what that basically means is that they are camps that are run by the Army in a way that normally you would run a camp if you were housing prisoners of war. These people are being treated as prisoners of war, but they're civilians.
In the case of one man by the name of Yuri Forchuk, later known as George Forchuk, a Ukrainian who immigrated to Canada in 1912, an escape attempt was successful. By 1914, he was arrested and sent to Jasper internment camp. After a few months, George escaped the camp as guards chased him and bullets whizzed past his ears. He was able to remain in hiding until the end of the war.
In some situations, people were tracked down and rearrested, but there were people who were shot and killed as well, trying to escape from prison camps in Canada.
A Ukrainian soldier by the name of John Dyken, in the 90th Battalion of the CEF, was interned at Castle Camp in 1916. John, with 2 other prisoners, attempted to run into the woods during their mandatory work period. After a few minutes, guards were shooting at all 3 men. One man was shot, and later John gave himself up in fear of being shot as well. Like John's friend, some escapees were not so lucky.
There was a long fight to have the grievances of internees and their families redressed after the First World War. It was only during the 1980s and 90s that Canadians largely began to recognize that not only had internment operations took place, but that they were morally and ethically wrong. Bowden Cordan, who's a historian at Queen's University, was one of the foremost advocates for Ukrainian Canadians and the commemoration of the camps and what was done during the war.
The internment initiative from the Canadian government was clearly set out with the intention to protect Canadians from enemy aliens during the First World War, but was clearly lacking valid organization, regard for human rights, or any kind of standardized structure. Most of these internment camps did, however, provide infrastructural and integral labor efforts for the Canadian landscapes. This was, of course, in the form of required work of prisoners under brutal conditions. From the circumstances depicted, as well as the conditions of the camps and their sanctions, it is no wonder that some of the internees decided to make escape efforts.